Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. I'm Joe Crane, the Director of Public Programs and Community Engagement. We're glad to have you along on this special Facebook Live from the multi-purpose room inside our library. And you'll notice on a few camera shots, you will see a very small, socially distanced audience, a few close friends, including a very close member of the DePue family, Mrs. DePue, in our audience tonight. They're here to give Mark a little support and give him some people to actually look out and talk to. And when you see how everybody's socially distanced in what is normally a capacity-filled room, you know why we can't really do public programs effectively with an audience. So we thank the handful of close friends and family of Dr. DePue that are here with us tonight. And of course, welcome the rest of you watching all across the land of Lincoln, across the USA, and around the world via Facebook Live tonight. We've got a special program for you, Iwo Jima, the crucible, the Pacific War's bloody crucible that Dr. DePue was set to talk about way back in the springtime. But of course, we all know what happened in mid-March to the state and around the world. So it was also supposed to be a kind of a double-edged program, Iwo Jima and Okinawan's one program, but considering how long the two programs were together, we've split them up into two parts. Tonight, Iwo Jima, and coming up on our Facebook Live Thursday, September 3rd, we'll explore the Battle of Okinawa. So without further ado, please welcome our oral history director and military historian, Dr. Mark DePue, with tonight's program on the Battle of Iwo Jima. Mark?
Thank you very much, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this important subject. I did a presentation about a year ago on D-Day, and it went over very well, I think, but I got several comments. Hey, how come you never talk about the Pacific Theater? I got that comment from some Marines, in fact, and a couple of them are here tonight, so I hope they appreciate the effort. It isn't by accident that we're doing this presentation on the 13th of August. On the 14th of August was the official surrender of the Japanese. And so the war ended, and all those celebrations back in the United States were on that date. And on the 2nd of September was the official signing ceremony on the USS Missouri. And so that's the reason for the timing for the Okinawa presentation. But Iwo Jima, one of the costliest battles of the war, and because of a picture that we're going to be talking about here in a little bit, it captured people's imagination like nothing else did in the Pacific Theater. And there's something that's very iconic now in terms of people's identity with that flag, with that picture, and with the Battle of Iwo Jima itself. And there'll be a couple times we kind of weave that into the process as we go along here. But we have to start with a little bit of strategies. For the first few slides, it's very much an overview. July of 1944, what's going on in the Pacific Theater at that time? Well, we'll see if this works pretty well. In the Central Pacific, you have basically a Navy force supported with Marines. Well, see, I was warned about that. Driving through the Central Pacific. And bloody victories in Tarawa. There's one of the real bloodlettings by the Marines. Seizure of the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, and the Marianas, which includes Guam and Tinian. So here are the Marianas Islands. And that's as far as the Navy and the Marines got by June of 1944. So how about the Army that's coming up from the south? And primarily that's led with Douglas MacArthur. Well, they have Guadalcanal and then New Guinea. They skip through some places to include Rabaul, and they're heading towards the Philippines. At least that's MacArthur's goal at the time. June of 19th and the 21st of 1944, you have the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And in that case, you have the U.S. Fifth Fleet, 15 aircraft carriers. Imagine that, 15 aircraft carriers against 9 Japanese aircraft carriers. And in the process, the Japanese lose 3 carriers, 2 actually to submarines. So that's a setback for them. But in the same time frame, you have what is now known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where the air fleet, the Japanese naval air fleet, is basically decimated after that. And there's really not much left. A lot of their senior best naval pilots died in that process. So that's where we're at in July. So July 1944 then, you have Franklin Roosevelt that goes out to Pearl Harbor and sits down with MacArthur and with Nimitz and with Admiral King and others. Admiral Leahy, who was essentially serving as the Joint Chiefs of Staff, although that wasn't the official title, he was there as well. And there was quite a debate. These gentlemen, some of them had very big egos, I think almost all of them did, had some serious disagreements about what to do. MacArthur, what he wanted was to return to the Philippines. You know, he had a strategic argument for that, but essentially the argument was the emotional appeal, the promise he had made to the Filipino people that I shall return. And he certainly wanted to do exactly that, to return to the Philippines. And as you recall, the United States had guaranteed the Filipino people their freedom in 1946. That happened before the war. And as far as the Americans were concerned, that was an obligation that we owed to the Filipino people. So that was MacArthur's argument. Admiral Ernest King and Chester Nimitz, they had a different proposal. They wanted to go to Formosa. Now that would make sense because they're coming from the Central Pacific all the way over to Formosa. And why did they recommend Formosa? Because most of the things that the Japanese military and the Japanese homeland really needed were down here in the Dutch East Indies. Rubber and especially oil and some other key supplies that they needed for their war machine. And if you're sitting in Formosa, you basically cut that off. So that was the argument that the Navy was proposing. Well, Franklin Roosevelt is a politician, and he finds ways to compromise, but the compromise essentially ended up favoring MacArthur's plan in a large part and allowed MacArthur now to continue his attack, his invasion of the Philippines, landing first at Leyte and then later on Luzon Island. And also now the Navy's going to have to think about kind of an adjustment to their strategy because they're not allowed to go all the way to Formosa. Now they set their eyes on Iwo Jima. That seems to be the next logical step for them. One more battle that I wanted to talk about while we're on this slide, and that's the Battle of the Leyte Gulf. It's really 4 separate engagements. These are all naval battles, essentially. 4 separate engagements all around the Philippine Sea, and what you've got is the bulk of the Imperial Japanese Navy versus the U.S. Third Fleet. So you've got 6 Japanese carriers versus 34 U.S. carriers. A lot of fleet carriers, a lot of smaller jump carriers, but 34 U.S. carriers. The Japanese lost 4 of their aircraft carriers, and they don't have the ability to replace those like the United States was doing at the time. The U.S. lost 3 of their aircraft carriers, but the advantage now is clearly on the Allied side, on the U.S. side. And after that, the Japanese Navy really is not going to present a major threat to the U.S. as they move forward. And one other comment here. The Air Force, their equation in there. This is the U.S. Air Forces, and we'll talk about a little bit more than this. They have 2 choices in terms of getting their aircraft to Japan. Just like in Europe, where the goal in the strategic bombing was to bomb Germany, and especially Berlin and some of the main manufacturing areas, their goal was Tokyo and so many of the other major manufacturing cities in Japan. So you could either do that from China and supplying these air bases in China by flying over the hump or over the Burma Railroad, which is torturous to begin with, was quite a logistical nightmare. Or that's why the Marianas Islands, especially Tinian, is going to be important. So it looks like the Mariana Islands are the place to go for that. So let's take a look at logistics, because I've already hinted on that a couple times. It's all about logistics, and this is logistics on a massive scale. You've got 6,200 miles between Okinawa and the West Coast. I should say between Iwo Jima and the West Coast of the United States. That's 26 days on the water. If you're talking about from Pearl Harbor, okay, now it's not 6,200 miles, it's only 4,000 miles in 17 days. This is a major hurdle. And now you've got to figure out, you can't just sail this huge fleet of hundreds of ships from Pearl Harbor or the West Coast to Iwo Jima. You have to have a staging area. And the Ulithi Atoll is the place to do that. Now, this is about 1,000 miles south and west of the Marianas Islands. And it's out in the middle of nowhere. And look at this. Here's the scale down here, 5 miles. Look how small these islands are. It's basically just a coral reef that you're talking about with a few islands that are peeking through. But when you get inside this coral reef, as you can see right here, hundreds and hundreds of ships. And that's where they had the major staging area. That's where they were able to do some major reconstruction and repair work on these ships. And huge supply depots. It's, again, only 1,000 miles from Okinawa and Iwo Jima. The 3rd, the 5th, the 7th Fleet are all there. The 7th was the one that primarily was supporting MacArthur. And you're shipping everything across the ocean there. Everything from bulldozers to Q-tips. Can you imagine the amount of oil that they had to ship from the United States? Or the tons and tons of ammunition that you had to ship over? Or aviation fuel? And cigarettes. Because I bet about the only thing you didn't want to ever run out of was cigarettes. The military ran on cigarettes at the time. And you had to supply hundreds of thousands of soldiers, airmen, Marines, and not only that, the war in Europe at this time is still going on. So a big push is still heading to Europe, and on top of that, the Russians and the Chinese are all screaming for more Lend-Lease supplies, and we're accommodating them with thousands of tons of Lend-Lease supplies, which includes a fair amount of the food that both of those countries are getting at the time. All of this because of this miracle of American production, both in factories and on farms, that is going on at the time. And that is something that I don't think you want to overlook at all. Okay. Now for my Air Force friends. The B-29. The B-29 was the most expensive project the United States did during World War II. And a lot of people think, wasn't that the atomic bomb? The B-29 cost $3 billion. The atomic bomb development cost $2 billion. Both of them are almost unimaginable to try to figure out the scale of these things. But here's some comparisons for you. It's close to being, I think it is the largest aircraft during World War II. The B-24, another 4-engine bomber, is a 110-foot wingspan, where the B-29 has a 141-foot wingspan, so much larger. The B-24 maximum takeoff weight is 65,000 pounds. The B-29, over twice that, 133,000 pounds. It has a longer range by quite a distance. It has a range now that reaches all the way from Tinian Island to Japan. Nothing else that we had was going to be able to do that and then get back. January 20th, 1945, a gentleman by the name of Curtis LeMay, for a lot of you can recognize that name from both World War II, but also all the way up through Vietnam War era, commanded the 21st Bomber Command. He started the war as a major. I tell you, there was some fast rank being made in the Air Force during World War II, because the Air Force was about that big at the beginning of the war, and it was massive scale by the end. And LeMay switched the main bomber force in the Pacific from China to the Marianas Islands. And he also made an important change as well. Before that time, what the Air Force was doing was daylight bombing, and because of the enemy defenses, they ended up pushing those aircraft much higher. I mean, part of the reason for the B-29's success is it had the pressurized cabin, as well as some very new logistics and new firing procedures on it as well. But anyway, so you can put these aircraft much higher, but then when you're flying that high in daylight, over cloud cover most of the time, and over tough winds, the accuracy was pretty dismal. So what LeMay does is let's switch from daylight bombing at high altitude to night bombing at low altitude, and oh, by the way, let's switch to incendiary bombs, and basically burn the Japanese cities out one after another. And that's what they ended up doing. Many of you are familiar with the results for Tokyo. The worst firebombing of the war wasn't Hamburg or Dresden, it was Tokyo, with the estimates of something like 100,000 casualties in that one bombing raid. And this is just one of many. By the end of the war, they had to make some decisions about what cities not to bomb, so they had something left over to use atomic bomb with. But that's a different story. So, March 9th and 10th is the bombing of Tokyo. That's right in the midst of the combat at Iwo Jima, but it's very much part of the story. From Tinian Island, Tokyo is 1,477 miles, one way. From Iwo Jima, which is pretty much right in the middle, equal distant, it's 760 miles. So instead of flying from Tinian Island, kind of making a dogleg around Iwo Jima, because there is Japanese fighters based there, now you can capture Iwo Jima and use that as an intermediate base in case some of these aircraft get in trouble maintenance-wise or they're damaged somehow, they can land on their way back from Japan on Iwo Jima. That's the strategic reason for Iwo Jima as far as the Air Force is concerned. And there it is, a mammoth aircraft. And you can see right in the bottom left of that picture the size of the crew. A little bit about the Japanese command at Iwo Jima then. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi, and I'm not going to try to pronounce some of these first names, it's a tongue twister for me. He takes command at Iwo Jima, and that's him in the bottom right, in May of 1944, and quickly recognizes that he needs to make some serious changes. And primarily, he's going to be focusing his attention on building the defenses, and we'll get into more of that here in a little bit. He was a samurai in tradition, the samurai Bushido warrior tradition. Their way of the warrior, that's what it stood for, the Bushido. And they were emphasizing the principles of honor, courage, skill in the martial arts, how to use a sword properly, how to use a bow and arrow properly, but beyond that point as well. Very much ceremonial in many respects. And loyalty. Loyalty to your master above all else. That was the code in which they lived. And he was one of those, but he was also a very pragmatic man. Part of his pragmatism perhaps came because he spent quite a bit of time in the United States. In 1928, I believe, he was an attaché in Washington, D.C. And during that time, he would travel across the United States, seeing all kinds of different things that were going on in the United States at that time. And I believe later on he came back and was also based in Canada for a bit. He even spent some time in Harvard University. And here was his comment that he made at the time that he was there in the United States. The United States is the last country in the world that Japan should fight. He knew. But he's now the commander at Iwo Jima, during a time when the Japanese fortunes are on the way down. General Senda was a more traditional view of things. And his concept, he also believed in Bushido, but where the two gentlemen disagreed was how the tactics were changing for the Japanese soldier at the time. Before this time, especially places like Taro, even at Tinian, Guam, other landings, Saipan, you would often have the major defense for the Japanese right on the beach. Stop the Americans right there on the beach, try to repel them. And if that didn't work, oftentimes it would be accompanied by major banzai attacks. And we all know about the banzai attacks. The Japanese would just in force charge into American machine guns and artillery and decimate it in the process. Well, Kobayashi thought that was just lunacy. And he wanted nothing to do with that. His approach was to dig in, allow the enemy to land on the beaches, wait till they get all clogged in on the beaches, and then unleash everything. But layered defenses, caves, tunnel systems, bunkers that were built. And again, he had close to 9 months to do that for Iwo Jima. Senda was more of a traditional soldier. He thought he was still holding on to the Bushido Code, the honor of dying in a banzai charge. The last thing you want to do is to surrender, because there is great shame in surrender. The Japanese had about 21,600 defenders in total on Iwo Jima. There was the 109th Imperial Japanese Army Division. There was a sizable naval guard force. There were some port troops. You notice I have the word kamikaze up there. Kamikazes had been introduced shortly before that time, and we're talking about naval airships attacking American ships. They are used to a certain extent here in Iwo Jima. It's going to be much more prevalent when you get to Okinawa. And a few other support troops as well. One other colorful character that I want to mention here is Lieutenant Colonel Takeshi Nishi. I think that's how you pronounce his first name. He commanded the 26th Tank Regiment on the island. He was a noted equestrian. He had purchased a horse when he went over to Italy because the Japanese were embarrassed in the 1928 Olympics. And I'm almost embarrassed to say the name of the horse. The name of the horse he purchased was Uranus. And he entered that horse in the 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles and actually won a gold medal in equestrian show jumping. And that's the one and only equestrian medal that the Japanese have ever won. He was something of a man around town. He had a convertible. He would drive around town. He cavorted with people like Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, all the Hollywood celebrities. He was very popular. And he ends up in Iwo Jima. He was popular in the United States. A lot of the old guard and Japanese army, especially the old cavalry, looked down their noses at him and figured, well, this might be a good place for him to end his career. But he would walk around and inspect the defensive works as they were being done with his riding crop in one hand and his cavalry boots that he was wearing at the same time. A colorful gentleman. Let's take a harder look then at Iwo Jima itself. Okay, the geography of the place. It's a volcanic island. It looks very much like a pork chop, doesn't it? It's 8.11 square miles. The name of the island is Iwo Jima because that's essentially, in Japanese, Sulphur Island. And that's what it smelled like, the volcanic sand that you had there. And one author that I read described Iwo Jima as a cinder clog, 4.5 miles long and 2.5 miles wide. So a tiny piece of land. Mount Suribachi, which we all know about, right here in the tip, a dormant volcano, 554 feet tall. That was the elevation. And from Mount Suribachi, you could see the entire island and probably the entire U.S. fleet out there east of the island itself. The way the Japanese looked at this, the way the Suribachi looked at this, is their defeat was inevitable. Suribachi went in with the notion that every single soldier there, all 21,000 plus soldiers, naval personnel who were serving there on the island, were going to die in the defense of the island. That was just a given. He had told his wife when he got posted there that's the way it would work out. I already talked a little bit about the evolution of the tactics, and the new tactics were to wear the Americans down, to bleed them white. And I thought it might be illustrative to read what General Suribachi's orders were to his troops. This is a quote. "We shall defend this island with all our strength to the end. We shall fling ourselves against the enemy tanks, clutching explosives to destroy them. We shall slaughter the enemy, dashing in among them to kill them. Every one of our shots shall be on target and kill the enemy. We shall not die until we have killed 10 of the enemy. We shall continue to harass the enemy with guerrilla tactics, even if only one of us remains alive." Those were his orders. Can you imagine American soldiers getting those kinds of orders? And the expectation that you're going to be staying here until you die, one way or another. He forbade banzai attacks. So just the opposite of what Senda wanted to do, Suribachi forbade them to use those tactics at all. And to dig in deep. That's what his goal was. And again, they've got 9 months to do that. And I believe, here's just a small example of some of the tunnels that were honeycombing Mount Suribachi, but the entire island, as you went north as well. That's what they were facing. That most of the Japanese were deep underground. Okay, well, let's look at the American command. Admiral Chester Nimitz, a Texan, a plainsman. It's so typical for the American Navy. They have all these people from places like Kansas and in the Plains area, they end up in the Navy. An Annapolis graduate in 1905, he was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific. So in naval jargon, he's SINCPAC, Commander-in-Chief Pacific. That's what that stands for. Quiet, a bit on the introverted side. FDR elevated him after he fired Admiral Kimmel. You might remember Admiral Kimmel, who was the commander at Pearl Harbor the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked. So Kimmel's sacked, Nimitz comes in. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the U.S. Fifth Fleet, a 1906 Naval Academy grad. He commanded a 2-carrier task force at Midway, so there's his claim to fame. Kind of a last-minute elevation, I believe, because Halsey, maybe, was sick at the time. And of course, Midway was this incredible victory, the turning point of the Pacific War. And so he's commander of the Fifth Fleet. Now here's one of the curiosities. Halsey is in the Pacific Theater as well, and when Halsey commands that same fleet, those same ships, it's the 3rd U.S. Fleet. And when Spruance is there, it's the 5th U.S. Fleet. Don't ask me, I'm an Army guy, I don't understand the way the Navy figures those things out. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, he commanded 70,000 seasoned troops during this campaign. He went by the nickname Howling Mad Smith. Now, there's a great name for a Marine, I think, Howling Mad. He remembered as the father of modern amphibious warfare, and at the beginning of the war, he was rigorous in training his Marines how to do exactly that, how to land on contested beaches and survive the process. He's almost, I had a hard time trying to sort through this. I don't know if I want to call him a figurehead, but he's not going to be directly involved in the combat as much as the next gentleman, and that's Major General Harry Schmidt, the Dutchman, who commanded the 5th Amphibious Corps. The 5th Amphibious Corps included the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions. A lot of these divisions, a couple of these divisions, this is the first major combat that they're going to see. But they had plenty of veteran soldiers, veteran Marines in their ranks who had been transferred around. So there's plenty of of experience in these units. They also had Seabees there. And that was going to be important because one of the first things you want to do when you get on land is get the airstrips fixed so you can have these B-29s land there. You had some UDT, underwater demolition teams, and you had 3 black companies that are all on the logistics and support side of things, but they're going to play a role here important once they get the major force on the land. Okay, the plan of attack and Operation Detachment, that's what they called this. Kind of a curious name, I think. They anticipated, Schmidt anticipated that this would be a 10-day campaign. Didn't know for sure how many Japanese were there. Some estimates were in the neighborhood of 10,000. So they were off on that number as well. The UDT teams are going to go in and recon as early as February 17th. That's a couple days before. And that recon is going to be crucial. Their job was to find out what the condition of the beaches were, where the defenses are, what kind of soil or sand they're going to encounter once they get there. The 5th Marine are going to land on the left at Green and Red Beach. And the 28th Regiment is right here. Their job is to take Mount Suribachi. That's their mission. And to do it as quickly as possible, because again, at Mount Suribachi, you can see the entire island. And if you got artillery up there, and they obviously did, you can harass and shell the entire landing force. The 4th Marines were on beaches yellow and blue, and the quarry was the main, toughest objective that they had. See, I did it again. Sorry about that. That was going to be the toughest nut they had to crack that first day. The 3rd Marine were in reserve, and we'll get to them in a little bit. Okay. Beforehand, you want to have a major bombardment of this. And the bombardment actually started months and months before. June of 1944 was some of the earliest bombing, and obviously at that time, you're not talking about a bombardment from ships, you're talking about some of the Air Force assets that they had, or even naval aviation assets that they had at that time. Going into the battle itself, though, General Schmidt, the ground force commander, 5th Amphibious Corps commander, asked for a 10-day naval prep. And the naval commanders at the time said, 10 days? We don't have that kind of ammunition to use on 10 days. That's almost impossible. We can't do it. They argued back and forth, and they finally agreed to 3 days. And because of weather, and because of a couple other factors, those 3 days were largely ineffective. And only in the last day or so did aircraft from aircraft carriers join in. And now this is much more of a pinpoint kind of an operation when you're talking about naval air coming in and blasting away. But again, how long have the Japanese had to prepare all of this? How deep did they dig into the island itself? D-Day, February 19th, 1945. Okay. There's the naval bombardment, and that begins. And a little bit more on the naval bombardment. Some of you might recall that I interviewed Charles Sahe many years ago. Charles Sahe was at Pearl Harbor on the USS Nevada on Pearl Harbor Day. His battle station was in the searchlight position high up on the mast. So can you imagine he's watching Pearl Harbor happen high up on the mast of the USS Nevada. The Nevada got sunk that day, but they raised it, they refurbished it at Bremerton, Washington. By Iwo Jima, it's there offshore providing naval gunfire support. Just on Monday, I opened up a letter from Charles, who's now 97 years old, and he wrote about what you're just going to hear. And he amazes me.
The USS Nevada was the flagship of the Iwo Jima U.S. invasion fleet. This meant that there would be an admiral on board the Nevada who would command the activities of the gunfire support warships, 8 battleships, 12 aircraft carriers, 19 cruisers, 44 destroyers, and 130 troop transport vessels and auxiliary ships. On February 16th, D-Day -3, the Nevada's main 14-inch guns provided gunfire to destroy enemy shore batteries. My 20-millimeter gun position stood ready to repel any incoming enemy aircraft missed by the 5-inch anti-aircraft batteries. As the Nevada closed to within 5,000 yards, she fired white phosphorus shells onto the beaches, creating a dense, acrid smoke to obscure the Japanese observations, with an added painful application of burns on exposed skin. The underwater demolition teams, the half-fish and half-nuts, coined by war correspondent Ernie Pyle, would enter into landing craft, then into rubber boats which took them toward the beaches. An after-action report by the swimmers included presence of mines, anti-tank traps, fixed obstacles, firmness of black sand, coral mounts, water current, temperature, direction, and surf height and strength.
Again, that's a 97-year-old who's writing those memories of that day. And it ends with this description of what the UDT teams do, going into the beaches to find out more about that sand. So for the Marines out there, I'm sure when you went to Marine Corps basic training, you heard lots about the sand of Iwo Jima. And I've interviewed 2 people, I've heard from others, who have vials or containers of that sand from that beach. Not necessarily because they were there that day, but that's the meaning it has. So we'll learn more about that, why it's so important to Marines in just a minute here. Because next up is the landing itself. D-Day, the 19th of February, clear and sunny. So they had a little break in that respect. At 6:45, the naval bombardment begins. And about that time, the Amtraks are being loaded up and are heading their way onto the beach. And you can see the landing craft now is in wave after wave, they're heading towards the beach there. At 0700, the landing craft are in line of departure 2 miles out. And 8 o'clock, the Navy stops firing, they stop their bombardment, and carrier aircraft hit the targets with bombs and napalm. By 8:30, the first wave of the LVTs, landing vehicle tracks, goes in, followed by 9 more waves. And that first wave lands at 8:59. The official designated time that they were to land is 9 o'clock, 0900. So they were off by only 1 minute. That's the precision that they had gotten to by this time of the war. They encountered really no significant enemy fire. General Kiribashi was very deliberate to hold off any kind of major fire for that time. He wanted to have the forces start landing and wave after wave until they were really crammed into there. And what the troops immediately found was a pretty significant trellis that they had to overcome, about 15 foot in a lot of cases, and soft volcanic sand, that dark black volcanic sand. And you step in it and you sink down your ankles. And then you've got 100 pounds of equipment on your back, and you're about 130, 140 pounds to begin with, and got that much more on your back. Try to run in that. It was almost impossible. They had plenty of tracked vehicles that were landing about the same time as well. But the tracked vehicles had the same problem of getting bogged down in that sand. And it was really only until in subsequent waves that they got some bulldozers there that they were able to cut their way through some of these, the trellises, and actually get into firmer ground once they got further inside. So the CBs are going to be important. Those bulldozers are going to be very important. I said they landed at 8:59, roughly 10 a.m., 1000 hours is when the Japanese opened up, when things were really congregated on those beaches. By 10:35, you have elements of the 28th that have actually gone far enough that they've reached the western side of the island. So they're pretty much on track. Things farther up the beach are really bogging down. It wasn't too much after that the 27th Regiment, I believe, the 27th Regiment, also of the 5th Division, got the base of the airfield number 1, just a little bit north of there. The toughest resistance, as they had anticipated, was around the quarry, all the way on the right flank. And a couple of the commanders figured that those poor souls, who is the rightmost man on the rightmost unit of the rightmost regiment on that side, you only can pity them and figure what their chances are going to be. Here's what John Lardner said, a New Yorker reporter, about the Marines who landed on Red Beach. And let me advance this just one slide or so. Here they are heading to the beach. You can see Mount Suribachi on the front left in front of them. And there they are once they actually got to the sand. Look how much, you can tell how soft that sand was that they're trying to navigate. Here's what John Lardner said about the Marines at Red Beach. Looking around, I had the leisure for the first time to think what a miserable piece of real estate Iwo Jima is. No water, few birds, no butterflies, no discernible animal life, nothing but sand and clay, humpback hills, stunted trees, knife-edged kuni grass in which mites who carry cerebtyphus live, and a steady, dry, dusty wind. That was the Iwo Jima that greeted them when they landed.
We were in APA USS Lubbock.
This is Warren Mush.
First troops on a brand new APA, so we got
with
royal
the 5th
treatment
Marines.
that morning for breakfast. We had steak and eggs and anything and everything you could want. Then we, at the proper time, we climbed down the cargo nets into our LCVPs and then rendezvoused out around the mothership. And then at a certain designated time, we took off for the departure line, which was where we all lined up to head for the landing beaches. And the first waves that landed hit the beach, and in an hour and a half to 2 hours, we're clear across the neck of the island with hardly any resistance of any kind. I landed in the 13th, HR was at 9 o'clock. I landed in the 13th wave at 1 o'clock and missed it by a minute or two of being right on schedule. And at that time, as I guess the best way to describe it was all hell broke loose, because the Japanese had all their mortars, artillery, machine guns, and everything zeroed in on the beaches and were giving us all they had. Hit the beach and the ramp went down. We all ran out and hit the deck, so to speak. Well, my first impression when I hit the beach on the island, I could reach out and touch a dead Marine with my left hand and with my right hand. They had a camouflage paint on their faces, and that's when the shock really hit me. I was there in the midst of the real thing. I started to raise up, and as I started to raise up, Japanese machine gun knocked that volcanic sand in my face about 6 inches above my head. I ducked down, looked around to my right, and another LCV was coming in right just beyond down the beach from where I had come in. As the ramp went down, a mortar shell hit right in the midst of the men as they were running off. I quickly decided the beach was no place to be, took off running from shell hole to shell hole, and to me, it's still a mystery how myself and my 18 men all arrived at the right place at the right time, designated spot.
Lieutenant Warren Mush was the battalion intelligence officer from one of the battalions in the 28th Regiment. That was the regiment, again, that had to take Mount Suribachi. By the time of the battle was over, his regiment had suffered 70% casualties, which was pretty typical for the fighting troops at Iwo Jima. The main target for his regiment, again, was Mount Suribachi, and that was the defense was commanded by a Colonel Atsuchi, and he had 2,000 Japanese soldiers defending it, and filled with warrens and caves and bunkers and artillery positions and everything else. Machine guns, plenty of that. But again, on D-Day itself, they had already isolated Mount Suribachi from the rest of the island. And the battle was bloody. It was foot by foot as the Marines are fighting their way up the slope of the hill, mainly on the north slope. The north slope obviously was the one that was observing the rest of the island. And by D+3, they had basically fought their way all the way up to the top. In fact, right at the end of D+3, there was a small patrol that reached the top, was able to come back down. There wasn't much resistance that they had by that time, and report that they were able to make it up to the top. And the decision was made, well, let's move on D+4 the next day, more determined push to make the top slope and secure it permanently. Now, about that same time, about a force of 300 Japanese decide the gig is up on Mount Suribachi. It's time for us to move north because we're not going to be able to survive this. So a group of 300 Japanese head north. Only 20 of them actually were able to make their way through the American lines to reach Japanese forces. They are met by Navy Captain Inoue, who was one of the senior naval officers in the Japanese naval force there. And Captain Inoue was outraged. This is not what Japanese soldiers are supposed to do. They're supposed to die in place, cause the enemy to bleed. And here's what he screamed out at these 20 who survived, especially to this lieutenant who had the senior member of that group. "You traitor, why did you come here? Don't you know what shame is? You are a coward and deserter. I shall condescend to behead you myself." So, being a good samurai, he takes his sword out, and he's about ready to decapitate this young lieutenant when his junior officers got a hold of him and grabbed the sword, and he didn't actually do it. What's his response to that? He's reduced to tears, and all he can say over and over again is, "Suribachi fallen, Suribachi fallen, Suribachi fallen," while he's crying. So, one of the more dramatic moments in the battle where there's lots of dramatic moments. On D+4 then, you've got Mount Suribachi, it's isolated. You've got a small group that then goes forward, gets to the top with a flag. Somebody's taking a flag with them. And the first flag raising occurs on D+4. And this is a picture taken by a Marine photographer of the first flag raising. Small and unpretentious, but that's the flag that the Marines around the airstrip and the ships out in the bombarding and supporting the landings, everybody sees this flag goes up, or everybody sees that moment when they realize there's a flag on the top of Mount Suribachi. So there's this huge cry and cheering. The ships start to blast their horns, and they're excited because we've achieved something. It's about that time that you have Navy Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, is with General Smith. They have now landed, and then they're in the vicinity of the airstrip, that first airstrip. And, of course, Forrestal looks up there and says, "Boy, that would be something to have. I sure would like to have that flag." And you can imagine what the commander of the troops that got it up there in the first place thought about some brass who decides they want to latch onto that flag. It didn't take it kindly. So a Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson decides, we're going to secure that first flag, but I'm going to have my men take another flag up there to replace it, and we'll give that first flag to Forrestal. So that's what happens. They decide that they get a larger flag from LST 779, landing ship tank. Those are the big ones that had the doors that opened up. You can pull right onto the beach, and lots of heavy equipment can come off of those. That's where they got the second flag. And several Marines take it up to the crest, to the hill, and that's around 1200 hours, noon. And it's that second flag now that you have a civilian photographer, Joe Rosenthal, takes that picture. That's the famous picture. And here's what Forrestal says to Smith about that time. Grimmer, Smith's first name is Holland. Holland mad. Holland. He says, Holland, the raising of that flag on Suribachi means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years. He knew the significance of that symbol that they had. Now, a lot of people probably think that was the end of the fighting in Iwo Jima. No, the fighting is really just getting started on day D+4. So now we've got a situation that looks like this. They've got the rest of the island. Let's see, it's about right here at that particular point in time. They've got the rest of the island to secure afterwards, and a very determined enemy to prevent them from doing just that. So combat, here's how I would explain this. Combat on Iwo Jima, I've spent a lot of time studying Civil War battles where you say this regiment moved here and that division or that brigade moved there. There's none of this. It's all individual, small unit actions, a squad, maybe a platoon. Somebody would have to step forward and take initiative. I was reading about one company that went through 6 company commanders in a single day. 6. And oftentimes you'd have a squad or a platoon that would be commanded by a corporal or a private first class or something like that. Somebody who's willing to step forward and take the initiative. The Japanese had carefully set all their bunkers and pillboxes so there would be interlocking fire. You think you had accomplished one thing, and before you know it, you're getting fire from the flank and you're taking in. So it was a slog, a bloody foot-by-foot slog that they had. When American artillery and mortar and airstrike came in, the Japanese would simply just withdraw in their caves until it passed and then they moved forward again. They fought in place, they stayed in place, they willingly died in place. Here's what General Smith, we just had talked about him again, here's what he said about Suribachi's Japanese defenses. Suribachi's ground organization was superior. The only way we could move was behind rolling artillery barrages that pulverized the area, and then we went in and reduced each position with flamethrowers, grenades, and demolition charges. Some of his mortar and rocket launchers were cleverly hidden. We learned about them the hard way through sickeningly heavy casualties. Every cave, every pillbox, every bunker was an individual battle where Marines and Japanese fought hand to hand to the death. And I'm reading a lot of these quotes because I think that's the only way I can begin to convey what the combat was actually like. Here's one of the authors that I was reading, how he described it. And one of the crucial weapons, and consider this as one of the crucial weapons, was the flamethrower. The flamethrower was the most practical weapon for clearing the enemy from caves, pillboxes, and bunkers. Horrific in its effect, it saved the lives of countless Marines who would otherwise have had to pry the enemy out in hand-to-hand fighting with an opponent who did not consider surrender an option. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't think of a more gruesome way to die than being engulfed by a flamethrower. One of the people who played a role was a gentleman that I had the honor of interviewing last year, Herschel Woody Williams, one of 27 combatants on Iwo Jima who ended up receiving the Medal of Honor. He was in the 3rd Division. The 3rd Division, basically, that was the reserve division, but it landed, I believe, on D+1 and very quickly was in the heat of the battle. And here's what he said about being selected now for a crucial mission.
When we went across the airfield, we had no protection, so we lost most of our people. Just as a statistic, when we hit the beach, we had 275 people in our company, and on March the 5th, we were down to 17. As we would try to break through the pillboxes, they had all the protection because they're in a confined area we're in an open area, jumping up, trying to run forward, and of course, they would just mow us down. And my commanding officer had lost all of his officers except 2, and all of his platoon leaders and gunnery sergeants and squad leaders, they were gone. And we were trying to break through a line of pillboxes that had been built to protect the airfield. So that's when he called for a meeting of the NCOs that were left in the company. So we gathered in a great big shell crater, had been blown out, and we could get below ground in that shell crater so that we at least wouldn't be shot at with grazing fire. And he was looking for ideas and trying to figure out what are we going to do from here, because there's not very many of us left. And that's when he asked me if I could use a flamethrower to eliminate some of the pillboxes. When I hit the beach, I had 6 individuals that were in my little unit, special weapons unit, that were flamethrower demolition operators. And well, by that day, the 23rd, we'd only been there 3 days, they were gone. I didn't have any left. I was the only flamethrower demolition guy in the company. So he asked me if I thought I could do something about some of the pillboxes with a flamethrower. And that was my job. I have no idea what I said in response to him. Some of the other guys said later that my response was, well, I'll try. So he gave me 4 Marines to support me, protect me, and go. I just said, come with me, and I put them in position to shoot at the pillboxes while I'm trying to get to the pillbox, and put the flamethrower on and took off.
Herschel was too modest, I think, to actually talk about the event itself where he earned the Medal of Honor. So I'd like to read the citation, or the relevant parts of the citation. Quick to volunteer his services when our tanks were maneuvering vainly to open a lane for the infantry through the network of reinforced concrete pillboxes, buried mines, and black volcanic sand, Corporal Williams daringly went forward alone to attempt the reduction of devastating machine gun fire from the unyielding positions. Covered only by 4 riflemen, he fought desperately for 4 hours under terrific enemy small arms fire and repeatedly returned to his own lines to prepare demolition charges and obtain serviced flamethrowers, struggling back frequently to the rear of hostile emplacements to wipe out one position after another. On one occasion, he daringly mounted a pillbox to insert the nozzle of his flamethrower through the air vent, kill the occupants, and silence the gun. On another, he grimly charged enemy riflemen who attempted to stop him with bayonets and destroyed them with a burst of the flamethrower from his weapon. His unyielding determination and extraordinary heroism in the face of ruthless enemy resistance were directly instrumental to neutralizing one of the most fanatical defended Japanese strongpoints encountered by his regiment. That's the essence of his Medal of Honor citation. Those 4 riflemen who were guarding him, I believe all 4 were casualties and 2 were killed. Again, that tells you something about the ferocity. And it's only something of a small miracle that he survived, only to be injured at the very end of the Iwo Jima campaign. With all these casualties that we've been talking about, you can imagine the field hospitals being filled up very, very quickly. And I wanted to read this quote as well because I think it's indicative of the attitude, the spirit that the Marines had at that time. And this is a comment that a surgeon, Lieutenant Graham Evans, wrote to his wife in a letter. I've seen all the surgery I want for a while, he wrote her. They come in with wounds that make you sick to look at, and they tell them, and you tell them, they must be evacuated, and they cry. Think about that. It's for that kind of reason that Admiral Nimitz said about the bravery that he was seeing at Iwo Jima. Among Americans who served on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. And that very much, this is going to be replicated in Okinawa as well, but that very much is what resonates about the Battle of Iwo Jima, I think. So the long haul. D+4, Mount Suribachi is seized. Increasingly, the challenge for the Americans is to support the Marines on the shore. And you can see LSTs in the background here on the beaches itself. These are landing ship tanks. Workhorse both in the Atlantic and the Pacific theater once you get in there. The challenge now is how do you supply this monstrosity that's on the land? And this is where you can see the congestion that you've got on the beaches. This is where the Black Marines and an Army company were also performing most of their duties, crucial duties to make sure that the supplies are moving forward and get them off the beach as quickly as you can. All the while, occasionally Japanese mortar and artillery fire would land right in the midst of them as they were doing this work. February 21st, kamikaze attacks start, persistent attacks on some of the ships offshore. And where can they go? They're not going to go anywhere. The Japanese know exactly where they're at. On February 27th, airfield number 2 is seized, so you're moving north by this time. And airfield number 3 by March 3rd. And again, D-Day was February 19th, to give you some sense of it. And again, General Schmidt said this is going to last for 10 days. Well, we still got a long way to go. March 4th, the first B-29 lands on airfield number 1. And there it is. The Dynamite, D-I-N-A-H, Dynamite, that was the name of this ship. It had a faulty fuel gauge. It had to land there in emergency. They were able to fix the fuel gauge, fill it up with more fuel, and get it off to Tinian Island. The first of hundreds that are going to land there, saving thousands of lives in the process. And again, that was one of the main reasons that they thought Iwo Jima was worth the fight. Japanese counterattack. On March 8th, the Japanese pose a significant night attack. 1,500 Japanese soldiers, a mixture of troops and naval personnel. And who's in charge of this? Because remember, Suribachi said there's not going to be any banzai charges, and that's exactly what they're going to be doing. It's General Senda and this Captain Inoue. Remember Captain Inoue, who was about ready to behead that young lieutenant because he had left Suribachi? These are the two men who decided they were going to do a banzai attack with 1,500 Japanese. And their objective was to get all the way back to Mount Suribachi, raise the Japanese flag on top of the mountain as a symbolic gesture as well. Exactly the opposite of what Suribachi wanted. So why did they do it? Because they believed in that samurai code, the Bushido code. And put yourself in the role of an average Japanese soldier. What way would you prefer to die? Now, I don't know if this is a factor, but in my mind, okay, I'll go to the banzai charge rather than hole up in a bunker someplace waiting for somebody to burn me out with a flamethrower. That's just me personally. They attacked at 2,400 hours with small arms, grenades, swords, bamboo spears. They were quickly illuminated by flares being fired by artillery and mortars, so it wasn't too much of a surprise for the Americans. Cut them down in mass as much as the Americans could in the banzai attack. By the time it was over, 800 Japanese had died in that attack. But not until there was hand-to-hand combat and some, again, touch-and-go experiences. I'm sure for the Americans it was a terrifying experience for them. So, now we're starting to make progress as we move farther north and farther north. So a series of dates here. By March 9th, the 3rd Division patrols reach the northeast coast, close to Katano Point. And here's where Suribachi is, right in this area right here, in his headquarters, deep in a bunker. By March 11th, the last escort carriers depart. They're moving on to other targets, Okinawa and some of the other targets that are going on. Close air support now is a responsibility for the Army, who can land on these airstrips that they now control. On the 14th, the Marine units begin to load for departure. And the War Department, tired of explaining to all those worried parents back home of the bloodletting that's going on with Iwo Jima, they declare that the island is largely secured. March 16th, the last Japanese resistance at Cushman's Pocket is crushed, and that's where we think Baron Nishi dies. His body is never found. Remember, Baron Nishi is the dashing cavalry officer who had his own horse. General Senda held out near Higashi, but his body is never found. Don't know what happened to him. And only the northwest corner of the island is still in Japanese hands. March 20th then, the 5th Division destroys the last Japanese pocket of resistance, and the U.S. Army arrives for garrison duty. General Suribachi and his staff are in Death Valley, in that area that I just pointed out on the screen. The evening of March 23rd, General Suribachi sends out one last message to the Japanese homeland, and he simply says this: "Goodbye from Iwo." That was the only message. The night of March 25th and 26th, the survivors, about 200 or 300 of them, launch a desperate pre-dawn attack. They slip through the 5th Marines. They attack with knives, grenades, pistols, rifles, oftentimes finding the GIs and Marines in their sleeping bags on these airstrips. So that ends up being a bloody melee as well. But the nearby Marines, including some African-American troops, come to the rescue and blunt that particular attack. The American casualties that night alone are 53 dead and 119 wounded. The Japanese lose 262, and a rare occasion, 18 Japanese are captured. March 26th, at 0800, the Battle of Iwo Jima is officially declared completed. Suribachi's body is also never found. It's thought that he committed suicide or he died in an attack somehow, and he had directed his soldiers to bury him deep so that he would never be found again. The battle lasted not 10 days, as was initially predicted, but 36, from February 19th through March 26th. So that just leaves this. As the Marines died at Iwo Jima, you really had nothing else you could possibly do but to bury them there. 6,821 dead. And of course, a lot of the nature of the wounds that they kept dying, so that was the eventual death toll. 19,217 wounded, so a total of over 26,000 casualties in this one battle against 21,000 losses for the Japanese. That is the highest percentage total of American casualties of Japanese anywhere in the war. And it speaks to the ferocity of the battle. Now, those who have been to Iwo Jima can probably verify this. Those graves are no longer there. Iwo Jima is Japanese land. It was the first Japanese territory that the Allied forces reached during World War II. And it's American policy that we will not allow American soldiers, Marines, Navy personnel, Air Force to be buried on enemy land. I believe most of those would have been brought back to Hawaii. But it's kind of an awe-inspiring sight just looking at those graves, all perfectly aligned. 216 POWs, and this is a curiosity, 3,000 Japanese hiding. Well, a lot of those would have been people that were never found because they were burned out, they were destroyed, they committed suicide deep in these caves. But that number of 216 POWs continued to grow over the next few months as some of these Japanese would come out of their holes and surrender, even, I believe, after the war officially ended in August. So, what's the next step? The Navy brass again meets in September 44, so this is several months before Iwo Jima battle itself. But they're trying to sort out, what do we do after we do get Iwo Jima? Where do we go after that? And you've got the same kind of discussion. Admiral King still favors Formosa down here. And most of the other brass, Nimitz and certainly MacArthur, but Nimitz is much more of a factor in this, say not from Iwo Jima, we go to Okinawa, that's the logical place next to go. And Okinawa is much closer than Formosa. It's a much smaller area. It's an easier lift logistically, and that's the decision that is made. And the code name for Okinawa then is Iceberg, and to initiate just a month or so after the fight in Iwo Jima ends. Okay, I end with this. The most famous picture of all of World War II, the flag raising in Iwo Jima, the three gentlemen who were part of the 7th bond drive across the United States. And the story about the bond drive and those gentlemen and the debate about who was actually part of that 6-man crew that raised the flag in Iwo Jima is a mystery that has only recently been resolved. I've got the next presentation here, Okinawa, on Thursday, September 3rd. I hope you check that one out as well. Here are the three that went around the United States, Gangnan, Bradley, and Ira Hayes. Some of you are country western fans remember the song that Johnny Cash wrote about Ira Hayes, a Native American. Here were the names of the people initially at the time of the fundraising drive that they thought were actually in that picture. Sousley and Hansen and Strank all died in the battle, and Bradley was wounded. So that tells you something right there. Of the 6 in this picture, which happened on D+4, by the end of Iwo Jima, 3 were dead and 1 more was wounded. But here's the curiosity. Now in 2019, those are the names that we attach. He's no longer in the picture at all. He's no longer in the picture at all, John Bradley. It's his son, James Bradley, that wrote Flags of Our Father. And when he wrote it, he thought his dad was part of the flag raising, although his dad was always very evasive about it, didn't want to talk about it at all. When would get calls, always around Memorial Day especially, you get calls from some journalist or somebody wanted to sit down and interview him for a nice piece in the newspaper, and the family was instructed, tell them that my father is at his cottage fishing. That's what they would always tell. And James Bradley finally did reach the conclusion himself that his father wasn't actually part of the flag raising. Was there, but not part of the 6. Okay, questions or comments?
Yes, Mark, we've got a lot of people watching the last hour all over the country, from Florida to Washington State to New York City to San Antonio, Texas, and all points in between, and several have pointed out very fascinating, very interesting stories. Not so much a question, but a comment from Clyde Wills, who's watching tonight, says, I'm watching in honor of my cousin, Franklin Sousley, who was one of the flag raisers, so a member of the one of the families watching tonight.
Well, that's special.
Yes, and we have a couple of other questions here. Let's see, Thomas Steinhardt asked the question, why didn't the forces land on the north?
The only landable beaches were exactly where they landed. Most of the other shoreline for Iwo Jima was pretty rugged coastline, steep cliffs, those kinds of things. So the sand that they encountered, that was the only logical place to really land.
Finally, again, a lot of great comments, not so much a lot of questions because I guess you did such a fantastic job of explaining everything. But Don asked, my father was in the 62nd Seabees. Could you say a little more about the role the Seabees played?
The Seabees, and these were, you know, the Marines were 18, 19-year-old kids, 20-year-old kids, you know, the full of vigor, and many of them, until they actually got to Iwo Jima, thought they were indestructible. They quickly learned otherwise. The Seabees, in many cases, were 30 or 40-year-old men who had spent their lives in construction work across the United States and decided to join the Seabees. They would land pretty early, and in a case like Iwo Jima, in a case like Okinawa and Saipan and Tinian, their job was to get on shore as quickly as possible, drive those bulldozers, lay the grading that they had for the airstrips, and get those airstrips operational as quickly as possible, and then start developing the logistical infrastructure that you would need for a long term. So the Seabees throughout the Pacific Theater were absolutely critical in the whole operation.
Well, very good. Any other final comments, Mark, on tonight's presentation?
I don't know if we have any questions or comments here. Yes, ma'am.
How did they finally find out the original men that raced it?
There were not just these pictures. There was actually motion picture film as well. And if you look here, this is really tough to see. Harold Keller here, all you can really see is the hand. In this picture, well, they have other ones, and a couple of these things, I think they determined it wasn't actually Bradley in the picture because I think he was not wearing a ring and the individual in the picture was wearing a ring. That's the level of detail. I mean, there was, the Marine Corps did official studies trying to sort all this stuff out. And Ira Hayes insisted all along that this was not, let's see if I go back a slide here. That was not Henry Hansen. Ira Hayes insisted all along that that was Harold Bloch. And I believe it's Harold Bloch's mother who looked at the picture initially and was insistent, that's my son, I know my son. I changed his diapers as a little boy. I've watched him grow up. I know that butt. Now, for her, it wasn't funny at all. It was an incredibly emotional thing, but she identified with that. And to know that your son was in the most important picture of World War II, that's some comfort, I guess. Okay, anything else? Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, again, if you noticed a few heads here and there in some of the camera shots, we had just a very small audience of some family and close friends of Dr. DePue to give him encouragement tonight. So for those of us in the room, let's give Mark a big round of applause. Dr. DePue, and of course we will see you back on Thursday, September 3rd for the second part of this battle across the Pacific. It will be focused on Okinawa, the doorstep to Japan, the brutal battle there.
And not nearly as well known as Iwo Jima, but every bit as fascinating, I think.
All right, that'll be coming up
join us.
Thursday, September 3rd, right here on the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum Facebook page. Thanks for joining us tonight. Have a good evening.